Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Bradley Hyman, the director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Unit at Massachusetts General Hospital. Brad also holds the John P. Pinney Jr. Professorship of Neurology at Harvard Medical School. Today, we will be discussing Brad's views on the changes happening in the field of neurology and possible futures we might expect. So let's dive in. Welcome, Brad.
Hi, Deb. Thanks for hosting me.
You are such an inspiration to me and to others. I'm sure today's discussion is going to be both interesting and a lot of fun. I always have I walk away just feeling energized after our conversation. So I'm really looking forward to this. Let's just kind of get started with, over the past few decades, our understanding of Alzheimer's disease has changed drastically. Can you just highlight some of these significant paradigm shifts you've seen? And, what are some highlights, or what have been some real challenges that still exist?
Well, Deb, since this is a podcast, people can't necessarily appreciate that when I started in this field, I had a wee bit more hair and it wasn't gray. So I started in the mid-1980s. Then Alzheimer's disease was viewed as sort of a rare thing that sometimes happened as people got older. And most of the dementia was attributed to vascular disease, to strokes, and to other problems with the blood vessels. And over the first decade or two, we learned that, in fact, it was just the opposite, was that Alzheimer's disease was by far and away the predominant cause of impairments as people got older. And also that as the population as a whole has gotten older over the last 40 years because of better healthcare and fewer people dying of lung cancer from smoking or heart disease or blood pressure related problems or diabetes, as healthcare has gotten better and people have lived longer, which is a great thing. The incidence of Alzheimer's disease, the likelihood of getting Alzheimer's disease, is directly related to how old you are. And so when people over the whole country began to achieve easily being 70 or even 80 or even 90, or do you remember when being 100 was such a special thing that you got a telegram from the president and right now, like people turn 100 about every other week.
Yeah.
And I think that this aging of the population means that more and more people will get Alzheimer's disease. And so now there are something on the order of 10 to 20 million Americans who have at least the beginnings of Alzheimer's disease, and a lot where it's become severe enough to really impact their daily life. And so what I've seen is, it's sort of a curiosity. This happens now and then, interesting from a medical point of view. And of course, it has always been devastating from the patient's point of view. To a lot of people have it. And it's, a threat to all of us looking forward to getting older. And so I know that you and I have talked a lot about sort of thinking about the future in a lot of different contexts. When I started as a fellow thinking about future of neurology, Alzheimer's disease was a teeny little niche. We could help some people maybe, but now I think for the average person, it's one of the things that they're scared about as they get older. And they're petrified that they're going to get Alzheimer's disease or, have their families have to kind of suffer through the process with them. So that's been a huge change.
With 10 million people, 10 to 15 million people, that kind of affects all of us because we've got people in our families, we know people. It's very, very close. And so when you start to see the effects, it is very scary. My grandfather passed away from dementia, and my grandmother from ALS. And just kind of watching my grandfather just go through that journey and just really kind of disappear from us, even though he was physically there. It's it's very scary.
You've said it exactly right. It's dreadful, obviously, for the patient, but in some ways, even more dreadful for the families.
Yeah.
Because they lose that wisdom and the interactions and the joy of knowing each other. And it's really miserable.
Yeah. Yeah. How did you, I don't know if I've ever asked you, but how did you choose this to be your, how did you get into research and why this area of research? I don't think I've ever talked to you about that.
Well, I was always a geek. I was one of those kids who played with rocket ships when they were 4 and 5 years old, and I never sort of outgrew that actually. So when I went to college, I was a chemistry major, and then I went off to an MD PhD program and got fascinated by the brain because I mean, from my point of view, what could be more interesting than how the brain works?
Right.
And decided that I was going to go into neurology. And then during your training in clinical fields, you're exposed to a lot of different things. You do these things called rotations, in which you're on the stroke unit for a little bit, and then you're on the neuromuscular unit, and then you're in the epilepsy unit, and so forth and so on, and little pieces of your field. And what happens is sort of magical, that all of these people who start undifferentiated, they start kind of vaguely knowing that they want to be a neurologist, but not really knowing what they want to do. They're exposed to these different patients and different teachers and different, aspects of the field. And like everybody sort of, wobbles around and finds their place. And so I was a little bit of a round peg and I wandered around till I found the round hole, and a place where understanding on a biological basis, on a chemical basis, how the brain worked was sort of that niche where my being a geek and my loving being a neurologist fit together. And understanding what went wrong in the brain of something like Alzheimer's disease, where really back then we didn't have any idea at all, was a huge challenge. And it felt like a place where, if you put some hard work into it, you might be able to make a contribution.
Yeah. How many, just to give kind of a size, if you can, how many people went into this area and this focus compared to maybe today? Do we have more people working to try to find these answers, or is it about the same comparatively?
No, it's been an absolute and I think appropriate growth in the field. If I think back to the first professional meeting I went to, where scientists and doctors from all over the country get together and complain. No, they talk about science and they talk about. And the first meeting I went to was the neuropathology meetings, and most of the science related to Alzheimer's disease was done by neuropathologists at the beginning. And there was one session out of 20 or 30 sessions devoted to dementia. And in that one session, maybe a third of the talks were about Alzheimer's disease. So just a handful of talks. And so I gave one of them, but I got to meet other people in the field who were just at the same time sort of starting out, because none of us really, had much experience. It was a brand new field. And now there's entire international meetings devoted just to Alzheimer's disease several times a year. So there will be one in Philadelphia coming up this summer, in which they anticipate 6,000 scientists and clinicians will be attending.
Yeah.
So that change is just really amazing.
Yeah, it needs a lot of people, a lot of energy, a lot of passion trying to solve, these mysteries here. It seems like there's been kind of these social perceptions or, stigmas around Alzheimer's, and how has that kind of changed or evolved? And what do you think is the role of researchers or clinicians playing to kind of shape these perceptions? Because there's communities, even here in the United States, there's communities of people or groups of people that don't want to talk openly about what they're doing, or what's happening with them as they age. And that's not necessarily good if you don't open up to your doctor, to your family. How do you see, is it changing these perceptions? And, what role does a researcher have to help that?
I think the perceptions are changing slowly. The challenge, of course, is that it's scary. And I understand why people would like to deny it a little bit and not really talk openly about it. Because if I say, oh, gee, I forgot where my car was when I parked it at the food store, right now I say to myself, that's because I was distracted. I was thinking about this cool podcast that was coming up with Deb Westphal and, how am I going to answer questions and why I hope I don't say anything too silly. And, so I'm not paying attention to where I put the car. And I come back out of the food store. I go, okay. And I find the car and I don't think twice about it. If consistently I was having these little memory lapses, would I mention to my doctor or would I be worried that my doctor would say to me, oh, I'm worried you might have Alzheimer's disease. And I just don't want to go down that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, substitute, my kids, my spouse, the doctor, my boss. There's no really good safe space to have that conversation in because it's scary and there are plausible other explanations, right? Oh, everybody my age is like this.
Yeah.
I'm not as bad off as Mary is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of ways that you can sort of reassure yourself that things are okay until they're really not. And so I think that the stigma is both sort of a societal stigma that somehow people, look down on you because you have some impairments, but also just plain scared. And I really understand that plain scared.
So, what do we do to change that perception? Because the more people come forward and talk about it, the more people that come forward and, allow for tests to be done or to donate their brain, will have a broader diversity of individuals to try to understand, and more data in this case may be better. More data is not always the best solution, but having that kind of diversity, especially if it's younger, like rather than once the disease really has manifest. What are your thoughts as to what we could do to kind of to help with that?
Well, I think you've put your finger on an important point. The disease often plays out over the course of maybe 15, 20 years. And the first, half of that, one can plausibly deny. And then it gets to a point where, oh boy, you just can't, something's really obviously wrong. And that's the point at which most people come to medical attention. And one of the goals of the Alzheimer's Association, and I think of research in general, has been to both destigmatize and also to encourage earlier diagnosis, earlier understanding of what's going on for two reasons, really. The first is as you said, that's really important for research, that understanding what those early changes are is plausibly when you're going to have the best shot at changing the course of the disease. Once I'm already bald, I'm not going to be growing hair back. If you caught me when I still had hair, well, maybe I could have done something about it. But the second reason is that even at those earlier points in disease, having your family and yourself understand what's going on and be able to plan a little bit for the future makes a huge difference. Because the amount of stress and pain that occurs because people just plain don't understand what the disease process is and what's happening to their loved one who has sort of suddenly changed and become, not paying attention anymore. He just never listens when I talk to him anymore. Well, I've heard that a lot as a doctor, and it's not the ears. It's that it's that there's a more fundamental problem, and the more that we can do to explain what's going on and to have people understand, the less stress there is, the stronger the relationships become, the better quality of life people have. And to me, that's really the most important reason is to try to help people. We all have a journey. We all go from one step to the next, and helping each other along that journey is what medicine should do.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think, I do think there are, groups like the Alzheimer's Association and just, even, media kind of follows this a lot more now. And, I think there are messages of hope, even though sometimes they don't seem to come fast enough. But I do think that is, I think that's correct. I think the other thing that's kind of happened in your career is a lot of technology. We've gone through some really crazy technology revolutions in AI and machine learning and imaging and all of that. I know that you've been kind of in the center of some big kind of innovations or growth in the imaging area. But how has these developments kind of revolutionized, if you would, or at least helped Alzheimer's research?
The issue that we sort of talked about a minute ago, which is when someone has a few mild symptoms, and the question is, well, is this just sort of getting a little distracted or a little anxious or a little whatever? Or is this really the beginnings of a process that will proceed and get worse? For, really until maybe 10 years ago, that decision was based upon a very experienced clinician's best guess. And a very experienced clinician's best guess is pretty darn good, but it's not easily adapted to many, many, millions of people across the country, and is time consuming and everything else. And what's happened in the last decade or so is a variety of technologies have been brought to bear where we can now make the diagnosis of the brain changes that occur in Alzheimer's disease in people, regardless of what their clinical symptoms are. And forgive me for a sec if I back up to what those brain changes are. There are three major brain changes. One of them is something called a plaque, an amyloid plaque, which is a deposition of a protein in the brain. And it's been actually first seen by Dr. Alzheimer in 1906 when he looked at a brain under a microscope and he went, gee, there's something that oughtn't be there. The second is something called a neurofibrillary tangle, which is made of a protein called tau. And Alzheimer saw those too. He said, there's something else that shouldn't be there. And so those are two new things that appear that aren't normally there. And then something that's normally there in your brain are neurons, billions of neurons, as it turns out. And they die in Alzheimer's disease. And ultimately, it's the death of those nerve cells of the neurons in your brain that lead your brain not to work as well as it used to. So those three components are sort of definitional for Alzheimer's disease: the presence of the plaques, the presence of the tangles, and the loss of neurons. And we now have ways with brain imaging with a special kind of brain scan called a PET scan to determine if there are tangles or plaques in the brain of a living patient. It used to be that you could only tell at autopsy looking under the microscope. And now, you can go to the PET imaging center at Mass General and, put your arm out and they inject the contrast dye. And 2 hours later, your scan is done and, you have a definitive answer. The brain shrinkage, also recent technology with MRI scans, a different kind of brain imaging that can be done in clinics can readily detect the loss of neurons. And so that's been a huge advance that really has just in the last decade and increasingly more sensitive and more specific. And then just in the last few years, those same technologies, those same problems have been able to be detected in blood tests. And these aren't quite in every clinic yet, but they're in every research center now. So I can take a blood test in my own lab at Mass General, at Harvard. We can run a blood test for the plaques. We can run a blood test for the tangles, and we can even run a blood test for neuronal distress. And so, I anticipate that in, I don't know, a year or two, however long these things take to commercialize and get available to the general public, that we're not going to be doing brain scans very much anymore, that it'll be just like you get your cholesterol checked, you get your blood pressure checked, you get your amyloid, tau, and neuronal health checked.
Yeah, that's big. That's really big because then you can start to do that year to year to year and see if there's changes.
Right.
When I started working with the trust, I was surprised that the gold standard, and this was, 3 or 4 years ago, that the gold standard for understanding what was going on in the brain was an autopsy, was a brain, a sliver of the
Mhm.
brain. And, that's wow, if that's the way we, do things. And so all these kind of new technologies, whether they're electromagnetic or, there's even, I've heard even of some kind of advanced sonogram to try to get in and understand. And that's just really amazing. And then the blood test. I was reading an article and, something, was it like a DHEA test or something like that they can do now in some of the clinics. And, I don't know if we're just starting to see that now kind of, more out there. And of course, cost is going to be and access is going to be an issue, but if we can do blood tests instead of using big heavy machinery, that's huge.
Yeah, no, I think it really will change the game. And also, depending on the person, of course, they come to me in the clinic and they go, "Oh, well, I forgot something once." And I go, "Okay, I'm not gonna worry so much about that." And, but now I can say, gee, let's grab a vial of blood. We'll see whether or not that's, whether there's any problems to worry about. And we can really reassure people with, data rather than with, it's my impression that things are going to be okay.
Yeah, because that variance there is really hard because one person's worry or irritant or pain it can be very, very different than another person's. And so
Oh
how
boy, it
does
sure can be.
wow, clinicians have to really kind of know that person to see where that level is to do that. So having something that is more kind of standardized, that's huge. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to that. And then the other piece of that, which has been an enormous change, is that just in the last really again 2 years or so, a series of medicines have been developed that get rid of the plaques. And remember, I said there are three things that are the big picture things that go wrong.
Hmm.
So one of them, we now have a medicine that absolutely reverses. And there's one medicine that's already in the clinic and available for mean, you have to qualify for it and so forth. But um, in most hospitals, I think you can get lecanemab, and then there's a second that is very likely to be approved by the FDA in the next little bit of time. The advisory panel just voted to approve it, and so usually that's a good way to anticipate what the FDA action will be, unless something unexpected comes up. So, there will be at least two medicines, and they seem to have very similar effects in their early testing. I'm sure that as time goes on and we test thousands and thousands of people instead of hundreds, that we'll be able to see if there's a little nuance that one is a little better in some circumstance or another circumstance. But they're very similar, and they both are very effective to get rid of plaques. And then there's a second group of medicines that are a few years lagging behind and are still in earlier stages of development, but maybe 5 years away from being able to get rid of tangles also. And, a lot of us are working on that third piece on how to protect neurons from dying.
Yeah. So is that where the major portion of the kind of research is to why are plaques building up? Why are tangles happening? I mean, it's wonderful if we have things that get rid of it, but why is that happening? And why are, the neurons dying? Is that kind of where the most of the effort is going to? Is that understanding?
You're absolutely right. And a huge breakthrough in this entire field is the ability to do genetic testing, because there are some rare individuals who develop Alzheimer's disease at like age 40 or even younger. And those are people who inherit it from their parents 100% of the time. If they have an abnormal gene, they get Alzheimer's disease. With the Human Genome Project, with all that effort that NIH put into this sort of crazy idea of being able to map every single gene in the whole in the human, with that having been accomplished, it was then possible to go to a relative handful of people who had these unusual, incredibly rare early onset problems and say, well, do you have a gene that's responsible for that? And that led to understanding the molecular mechanisms that do exactly what you say, that lead to the deposition of plaques, for example. And the genetics is giving us insight both into the tangle formation and also to some extent into vulnerability for neuronal loss. But it's also, that's the first light switch, right? You turn on the light switch and you walk down the hall and you see what's there. So the genetics has been super exciting and really important. And now we're moving through both new genetics and then also newer technologies that allow us to interrogate on a single cell basis. So just what's going wrong with a cell that gets a tangle? What's going wrong with a cell that's vulnerable to die? And that's where the field is now. And again, I anticipate that, in the next decade for sure, we're going to have answers to those two questions.
Yeah, that's really encouraging. And I think I've heard that there's people that actually have the disease, but they don't manifest the symptoms, and we don't know why that is either. Is that true?
It's completely true, and it's one of the things that makes it complicated to discuss, because the term Alzheimer's disease is used by some people to just refer to the symptoms. It's a synonym with dementia. It's, oh, they've got Alzheimer's disease, and it's a way of describing that their memory is no good, that they're having problems finding words, and all the other symptoms that people have. Scientists in the laboratory tend instead to refer to Alzheimer's disease the way that neuropathologists always did, which was the presence of plaques and tangles in the brain. And it's entirely possible to have some plaques and tangles in your brain and not have any clinically detectable symptoms. So much like with with hardening of the arteries, with atherosclerosis. Once it clogs off completely and you have a heart attack, well, that's pretty obvious. But if it's only 50% occluded and enough blood is getting through to not be causing you any problems when you're, you know, doing your day-to-day activities, well, then do you really have heart disease? Well, if you think about it, it's not good to have 50% occlusion. Yes, you do. If you think about heart disease as being defined by having had a heart attack, well, no, you don't. And Alzheimer's disease is similarly, depending on how you use the term, it's either referring to the symptoms or to the presence of plaques and tangles.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So you can have lots of plaques and tangles, and as long as you have sufficient cognitive reserve, you can sort of get through okay. There's two anecdotes that I'll tell that illustrate that. One of the first patients I saw when I moved to Boston happened to be a professor at a local institution. And he was teaching graduate level mathematics. Now, I'm really proud of my ability to use a calculator. I can add, I can subtract. I'm pretty good with multiplication, division. You get to advanced level mathematics, and I'm kind of not right. But so I'm interviewing him, and he explains that he used to be able to go to the blackboard at this graduate level mathematics class and derive the equations just off the top of his head when he was teaching the class. And now he had to prepare for the lecture, and something was wrong. And I said, gee, I don't think that you meet any criteria for dementia yet. You're still teaching, graduate level math classes.
Yeah.
But as fate had it, he was right and I was wrong. That this was the first symptom that he had of a process that I walked with him for the next decade as things got worse and worse and worse. So at that first time he visited with me, did he have Alzheimer's disease? Well, sure, not by the definition of clinical impairment, but chances are he already had some plaques and tangles in the brain. And this was so many years before we had the technical ability to detect it that, we would never have known.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. Like, wouldn't that have been wonderful to have some of this technology so that you could peer in to see? Yeah.
Right.
What was
Right.
it? What's the second antidote?
Oh, that there are, in fact, some people who are resilient. And they, in my mind, are both fascinating and informative because they have plaques and tangles in their brain, but they don't lose neurons and they remain cognitively intact.
And we don't know why.
And we don't know why. And we have a big project at Mass General that's directed by my colleague, Teresa Gomez-Isla, who's a clinician scientist, trying to understand why. And there's some clues that are beginning to come out from the genetics of those individuals and from some biochemical studies that we've done. But if we could understand how your brain could sort of put up with that damage, but not succumb to it, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, and I know you're just a natural collaborator, and you try to connect people, and I think you view that the answers are really in these kind of multidisciplinary collaborations. As you were just talking, I was thinking about some of the other things that are out there that people are exposed to just in life and their experience and their financial situation, or where they live, access to good food, all of that. It seems like it's a very kind of complicated research kind of effort to understand this. What are your thoughts on the importance of collaboration? And especially when it comes to like younger researchers that are just getting into the field, and or even some of the institutions that are out there, and how can they help with some of this?
Well, as you just said, it's a complicated problem. It's a problem that has eluded us from solving for decades and decades and decades and decades and decades. And I am absolutely convinced that the only hope we have of moving from where we are to where we want to be is to bring together really good people who are together committed to solving these problems and to adding whatever little piece they can to doing that. And so in our own little unit, and I know you've met many of these people, we have experts in chemical biology and experts in organic chemistry and experts in imaging and experts in optics. And we bring them all together to say, okay, how can we develop new technologies to answer this question? I want to know why neurons die. How are we going to be able to learn that? And our team really is multidisciplinary in the best way. And then we just reach out to, wherever we can to try to solve problems. And those answers can come from lots of different places. I recall that once when we were building a new microscope, we needed to get a camera that was more sensitive than the one we had. And somehow or another, I got the name of some scientist at NASA, and I just called him up out of the blue and went, "You guys put cameras up on those satellites that are supposed to see stars like a gazillion years away. Like they must be pretty sensitive to light." And we got to chatting, and sure enough, he gave me the advice that I needed to be able to build the microscope that we wanted to build. Now, I'm sure this NASA scientist never once before in his life, and probably never since, thought about looking inside the brain. And it might be the only time I've thought about looking out at outer space, but you put things together and good things come out of it.
Yeah, that's a great story. I love that. So, kind of transitioning to the future and looking ahead, a lot of technology things are happening, a lot of changes are happening. What do you believe will have the most profound effect? Will it be imaging? Will it be AI? What, just take the next 10, 15 years. What are you real hopeful when it comes to technology and its relationship to understanding the brain?
I'm super hopeful. And I think that there are two places where new technologies and potentially even AI and AI related sort of technologies will really come to bear. First is this early diagnostic piece, because it really makes sense that if dying neurons is what ultimately leads to the brain not working, which sort of makes sense, then intervening in the disease before those neurons die and before there are symptoms that are overt and obvious to a clinician is the place to be. It's just like taking your cholesterol medicine before you have that first heart attack, right? You want to kind of put off that heart attack and slow down the whole process. And there, I think that there's already very promising data with digital technologies, with information from people's cell phones and Apple Watches, and how many strides do they take a day, and how efficient are they at this or that, or how much sleep do they get? And those algorithms are in early stages, and they sure don't apply to an individual. It's not like you can say, "Oh well, Peter talked on his phone for 6 hours yesterday. That means that he's going to have an earache." I mean, but right now we're at a point where if you take data from 1 million people, like you see patterns beginning to emerge. And I'm hopeful that the kind of computational ability to begin to get, ooh, there's a little red flag. That's, something just like your doctor asks you, "Oh, are you ever short of breath?" That's a little red flag. And we have to learn what questions to ask, which might be a highlight to, oh, there's problems coming down. And I think that AI will go a long way towards teaching doctors and individuals in their own life, what to keep track of. My iPhone now reminds me to stand up once an hour. To be honest, I wish I could figure out how to turn it off because
When it starts to push you out of the chair is when you need to
yeah,
really
really,
worry about,
really,
right?
really. But I'm sure somebody figured out that like people who stood up once an hour were healthier than people who didn't, and now my iPhone is telling me to do that. I have to confess I ignore it some of the time, but actually it motivates me to stand up now and then. And it wouldn't surprise me if, some years from now, if we had similar sorts of algorithms that we would alert your doctor that, look into this. There might not be a problem, but it's a pattern that we're seeing that might be a little red flag. So I think that's going to be really important. And then the other piece that we've already talked about a little bit are these blood tests. I really think they're going to be game changers. And I've seen some data in the last 2 or 3 months in which even a drop of blood is enough to do these tests.
Wow.
So you could do a little finger prick and have the answer. You wouldn't even have to go to the doctor's office to have your blood drawn.
Yeah. Do you ever think that we will find out somewhere in the future that these diseases are not age related, that they're actually something else? I mean, when you think about the blood tests, when babies are born, we take their blood and, we kind of get that initial baseline. Sometimes that data is lost over the course of the journey of the person. But if these blood tests become that important, might we find that these are not really age related, that they're related to more behavior or environment or something else that's going on? I know we've had the disease with us for a long time, but what are your thoughts on that?
That's a really complicated question, Deb. I think it's very likely that all the things you just mentioned will contribute to, resilience or vulnerability, right? So that if your general health is poor, a certain number of tangles and plaques, to sort of simplify, causes more symptoms. And by contrast, if you're in great shape, probably you can withstand sort of more damage than you could if you had lots of different things going on. And so that's from a health perspective. The same thing for diet. Certainly the same thing for exercise. There, the data are quite strong. How much any of those things specifically contribute, still kind of unknown. And it's fun to go back in time as best we can and ask questions like, is this a new problem or is this just newly recognized? And I'm not a historian of medicine, but there are people who make their careers doing this. And I read this wonderful treatise, and I hope I'm not wrong with the details of it. But of course, the ancient Greeks had these medical treatises, and apparently there's some examples of what sounds just like Alzheimer's disease in those ancient texts, and actually in some of Shakespeare's plays, there's characters who if looked at with our current viewpoint, would have had Alzheimer's disease. And so this disease has been with us for a long, long time and always associated with aging. And whether there's something else that's sort of pushing that too, well, I don't know. It's a great question.
Yeah, it's probably just my position that we shouldn't just take so many things in our life as we get older as just, well, that's just how it is. We're just getting older, because I do think that, and again, it's back to society and perception that says, well, you know, you shouldn't be doing that at your age, or, you're too old to be doing that, or, well, that's just how it is. And a lot of that is not true. It's just, you don't need to fight age or not accept it, but you shouldn't have to just embrace it as, well, this is this is just how it is. And so that's just probably my bias on asking that question is, because if you shorten your journey by cutting off, 20, 30 years on the back end because you've reached this magical age number that you can no longer do fill in the blank, that's not a lot of fun. And so
I share your bias, but
yeah.
you know,
Yeah. So I know that you do a lot of mentoring and with researchers and other clinicians. What kind of drives you? And you're passionate about it, and you seem to love it. How important is that? And just talk a little bit about how you mentor and what gives you that motivation to do that.
I think that all of us get joy from watching our kids grow up, right? Or watching our neighbors' kids grow up, or watching, and some people, that's such a big part of their personalities that they become teachers or they become, in more formally involved in that process. But I don't think I've ever met anybody who hasn't had a huge smile on their face when they tell me that they just became a grandparent. And so I think there's just a lot of joy in watching people grow and helping them grow as best we can, and then seeing just how amazing it is that what they turn into.
Yeah.
So for me, that brings a lot of joy.
Yeah. And then just the challenges of young people getting into research. It's a hard field. It's a hard kind of profession. What words of encouragement for those, especially in this day and age? It just seems like there's a lot of pressure, a lot of people to answer to. They want to do the research, but yet there's all these other things around getting funding. What kind of words of wisdom do you give to them to kind of stick it out and continue on their professional journey?
Well, objectively, yeah, you're right. That there's not everybody who starts, manages to, become a successful researcher. I think that's true of every field of life. Not everybody who wants to be a baker actually has their bread come out well. I can say that from personal experience. But to become a researcher, I mean, for me, it's just an amazing field. You have the opportunity to data drive what you're thinking about. You have the opportunity to be curious and have other people around you share that curiosity and encourage it and say, I wonder. I don't know of another job where the words "I wonder," launches a new field. So for me, I just pinch myself that I've been fortunate enough to be able to work in an area where my curiosity and what the things that I want to do will lead to the opportunity to help people, will lead to the opportunity, at least the hope, that will make a little bit of a difference. And that'll help somebody else make a little bit of a difference. And that together will actually make a difference for people as they deal with this awful, awful, awful disease. So, I think it's just an amazing opportunity. And the young faculty who I work with, they have that opportunity too. And it's not for everybody, but for those folks who really embrace it, there's nothing better.
Yeah. Well, as we kind of wrap up, you did talk about what you think are some of the big breakthroughs, some of the big things that you're hopeful for the next within the next 5 or 10 years. New technology, blood tests, maybe some understanding of why plaque entangles happen. Is what is your greatest hope, either personally or professionally, because you've gone through a lot of evolutions in your career. I know there's a lot of things that matter. What is that kind of land on that greatest hope question that you have?
Well, we alluded to it a minute ago. I think the thing that really drives my career is the opportunity to visit with people every week who are going through this disease and be with them step by step in their journey and their family's journey with them. And that's so much pain, so difficult for people that, I hope I can do something useful. I hope I can help a little bit. And if we figure out how to keep neurons from dying, I feel there's a good chance that would be something useful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I am confident that you are adding that value to people's lives and doing that because of just who you are. So I really, really appreciate the time that you spent today and just kind of sharing that perspective of how fast things are changing. And, just that message is one of hope and of course it's complicated. It's very complicated, but really, really appreciate that. How would people, if they want to reach out, if they want to try to get in contact with you, how would they do that?
The simplest thing is my email. It's BHYMAN, for first name Brad, so B, and then my last name HYMAN at MGH, which stands for Mass General Hospital, .harvard.edu.
Wonderful. And we'll put that in the notes here too. Is there anything that you wished I would have asked, that we would have covered, that you want to just kind of land on at the end here, that you want to say or get out there?
I just want to say thank you. I think the more that we can do to familiarize the public as a whole as to the hope that science brings is really important. And also, as a general rule, and then specifically for Alzheimer's disease, I think the stigma that you referred to, the sort of concerns that people have as they begin to have a few symptoms, the more that we can do to get out there and say to people, no, really, there's hope. There's a lot of good people working on this. You're not alone. And one way of saying you're not alone is by talking with Deb Westphal.
Yeah, and you've been such a great partner to the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. You make your time, available, and it's been wonderful. So again, thank you very much for today, and I think you have a wonderful trip coming up. So I hope you're safe and enjoy yourself.
Thank you so much, Deb.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.